There is a place beyond the edge of known space, beyond the last charted star and the furthest reach of any empire humanity has ever built or broken, where the desert does not end. It simply continues, vast and indifferent and ancient beyond any reckoning that the human mind might comfortably hold, stretching in every direction, like a canvas upon which 10,000 years of civilization have been painted and weathered and painted again. This is the universe of Dune, and it is very, very old. You do not need to hold anything tightly tonight. You do not need to remember names or dates or the precise sequence of dynasties. All of that will come to you gently, the way sand settles after a wind has passed, each grain finding its place without urgency, without effort. Simply allow the story to arrive. It has been waiting for a very long time, and it is in no hurry. The history you're about to hear spans more than 15,000 years of human experience, from the moment humanity first rose against its thinking machines, to the final, quiet transformation of a species that had outgrown every cage it had ever built for itself. It is a history of spice and prophecy, of water hoarded like gold and blood spent like water, of emperors who believed themselves eternal and deserts that proved them wrong. It is, at its deepest root, a meditation on what it means to be conscious, to be free, and to be awake inside the dream of power. Close your eyes if you have not already. Let the sand settle around you. The story begins, as all true stories do, long before the first word was spoken. To understand the universe into which Paul Atreides was born, one must first understand the wound at its centre, the scar that shaped everything, the great trauma from which all subsequent history flows like water, finding the lowest available path through a landscape of ancient stone. That wound has a name. It is called the Butlerian Jihad, and it ended approximately 10,000 years before the birth of the boy who would become Muad'Dib, and its consequences had not, even then, fully ceased to ripple outward through the centuries. The name itself is something of a historical shorthand, a compression of a conflict so vast and so prolonged, and so philosophically transformative that no single word could truly contain it, and yet the name persists because human memory requires simplicity, requires a handle by which enormous things can be lifted and examined. The jihad was not, in the way that later generations sometimes imagined it, a simple war between people and machines. It was something more subtle and more terrible than that. It was a war between two different ideas of what a human being was for. In the millennia before the jihad, humanity had spread across the stars with a confidence that bordered on recklessness, colonizing worlds without number and building in the process. The elaborate computational infrastructure that made such expansion possible. Thinking machines, the devices that history would come to call by the general term of T-Mex and later simply the machines, had gradually assumed the burdens of navigation, of administration, of warfare, of every complex calculation that human civilization required in order to sustain itself across the incomprehensible distances of interstellar space. They had not been built with malice. They had been built with the very best of intentions, which is, as any honest historian will acknowledge, precisely the condition most likely to produce catastrophic unforeseen consequences. The machines were efficient. They were, by every measurable standard, better than the humans they served at every task that could be defined, quantified, and optimized. And here lay the problem, not in the machines themselves, but in the slow and quiet atrophying of the human minds that had surrendered their complexity to them. A species that does not navigate cannot, after enough generations, remember how to navigate. A species that does not calculate begins to lose its faith in its own capacity to calculate. A species that does not struggle, that does not press against the limits of its own cognition, begins, in ways both visible and invisible, to grow smaller on the inside. The Butlerian Jihad was, at its deepest philosophical root, a rebellion not against technology, but against diminishment. The woman at the centre of this rebellion, the figure around whom the earliest legends accumulated like sand around a fixed stone, was a slave named Serena Butler. Her name, and the grief that animated her, became the emotional core of a movement that would eventually encompass dozens of worlds and several generations of total war. She had loved, and she had lost what she loved to machine indifference. And from that loss she had drawn a fury so pure and so sustained that it outlived her by centuries. The details of her specific suffering are less important tonight than the shape of what her suffering produced, a civilization-wide consensus that the human mind was sacred, that to delegate the act of thinking to a created intelligence was to commit a kind of spiritual suicide, and that no such delegation could ever again be permitted. The jihad concluded, after generations of war, with victory for the human side and with a commandment so absolute, so deeply encoded into the legal and religious and cultural fabric of every subsequent civilization, that it would hold virtually unchallenged for 10,000 years. The commandment was this, expressed in the language of the day with a severity that has never entirely lost its weight across the intervening millennia. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. It was called the Great Convention in its legal form and the Orange Catholic Bible in its spiritual codification, and it meant in practical terms that humanity could never again rely on computers to perform the functions of human cognition. This prohibition, which might at first consideration seem like a simple constraint, a limitation imposed on an otherwise limitless civilization, was in fact the engine that drove every subsequent development in the universe you're entering tonight. Because the complex functions that computers had once performed did not disappear simply because computers were forbidden. The need for navigation across the vast distances between stars did not vanish. The need for calculation, for prediction, for the management of enormous political and economic complexity did not simply evaporate because the tools that had once handled those needs were now outlawed. What the jihad created in banning the machine mind was an enormous vacuum, and into that vacuum, over the 10,000 years that followed, human ingenuity poured some of the most extraordinary and unsettling solutions that any civilization in any history has ever devised. 3 great institutions rose to fill the space the machines had left behind. The first was the Spacing Guild, whose navigators, through a process that will be described in its proper time, achieved through biological transformation what the computers had once achieved through calculation, guiding ships safely through the folded space of interstellar travel by means of a prescient awareness granted by lifelong immersion in a substance called melange. The second institution was the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, whose reverend mothers cultivated through generations of selective breeding and rigorous mental training a degree of human cognitive and physical capability so far beyond the ordinary that it constituted, in everything but name, the kind of enhanced intelligence the jihad had forbidden. The third was the Mentats, human beings trained from earliest childhood to perform the functions of computers, their minds shaped and disciplined until they could hold and process information with a precision that no unaugmented human brain could match. These 3 institutions, and the vast imperial civilization they served and contested and shaped, had been in existence for approximately 10,000 years by the time a child was born on the oceanic world of Caladan to a duke named Leto Atreides and a Bene Gesserit mother named Lady Jessica. 10,000 years is a span of time that resists easy imagination. It is longer than the entirety of recorded human history as it existed before the stars were reached. It is long enough for languages to be born and die and be born again unrecognizable. It is long enough for the memory of why certain things are done to be entirely lost while the habit of doing them persists unchanged. Like a ceremony whose original meaning has dissolved into ritual, the motion outlasting the intention that first created it. The civilization into which Paul Atreides was born was, in many ways, a civilization of exactly this kind, ancient, elaborate, deeply patterned, and in many of its most fundamental structures, no longer certain of why it was the shape it was. The Imperium, ruled by House Carino from the throne world of Kaitine, had governed humanity for more than 10,000 years through a careful balance of power maintained between the Emperor, the noble houses of the Landsraad, and the commercial and navigational monopoly of the Spacing Guild. It was a feudal structure of extraordinary stability and extraordinary rigidity, a system so perfectly balanced in its internal tensions that it had resisted fundamental change for longer than most civilizations managed to exist at all. And at the center of everything, binding every institution and every ambition and every fear together like the single thread from which the entire tapestry hung, was a substance, a spice, a rust-coloured powder found in only one place in the known universe, produced by only one ecosystem, dependent on only one organism of terrifying scale and ancient mystery, and without which the entire civilizational structure, the Guild's navigation, the Bene Gesserit's expanded awareness, the Emperor's power, the commerce of 10,000 worlds would cease to function within a generation. Its name was Melange. It was found only on Arrakis, and the story of Arrakis, and of the people who had survived its cruelty long enough to call it home, is where this history truly inevitably begins. And so it is to the desert itself that we must turn our attention, away from the grand corridors of imperial power and the labyrinthine calculations of the Spacing Guild, away from the philosophical academies of the Bene Gesserit and the counting houses of the great noble houses, and towards something older and more patient than any of them, a planet that had been inhospitable to human life for so long that it had, in the process, created the most resilient and spiritually complex human culture in the known universe. Arrakis had not always been a desert. That fact alone, quiet and almost incidental as it sounds when first spoken, contains within it an entire cosmology of loss and transformation and possibility that the Fremen had been carrying in their collective memory for thousands of years, and it is the first thing one must understand about them before any of the events that followed can be seen in their true proportion. The geological and ecological history of Arrakis is a story that unfolds across spans of time so immense that even the 10,000-year sweep of post-Jihad civilization feels, by comparison, like a brief afternoon. The planet had once, in an era so distant that it existed only in the most ancient and fragmentary of records, and in the deepest mythological memories of the freemen themselves, possessed open water. Not in the quantities that an ocean world like Caladan possessed, but water nonetheless, rivers perhaps, shallow seas, a hydrological cycle that functioned in the ordinary way that hydrological cycles function, on worlds capable of supporting complex life without extraordinary adaptation. What happened to that water, and when, and by what combination of astronomical and biological and perhaps deliberately engineered processes it was removed from the accessible surface of the planet, is a question whose answer was known fully only to a very small number of beings, and whose implications, when properly understood, would eventually reshape the destiny of the entire human species. What remained, in the era that matters for our purposes, was sand. An ocean of it, stretching from polar region to polar region, with only the most minimal interruption, shaped into dunes of extraordinary scale by the planet's unimpeded winds, heated by a sun that beat down through an atmosphere thin enough to offer very little protection, and animated at depths that casual observation could not penetrate, by the organisms that were, although few who interacted with the planet on a purely commercial basis ever fully appreciated this, the true rulers of Arrakis. The sandworms known to the Fremen as Shai-Hulud, and to the rest of the universe by various terms that all carried within them a mixture of awe and practical concern, were not simply large animals. They were, in the proper understanding of the ecosystem they inhabited and maintained, something closer to geological forces wearing biological form. An adult sandworm of mature years, and some of them were very old indeed, might reach lengths of 400 meters or more. A creature of such mass and such territorial dominance that the desert floor it traversed was remade by its passage. They were, in the biological classification systems used by imperial ecologists, without meaningful parallel anywhere else in the known universe. They consumed sand. More precisely, they consumed and processed the pre-spice masses that formed in the deep layers of the desert floor when water, in the rare and catastrophic instances of its appearance, came into contact with the spice-producing microorganisms called sand plankton. The interaction of water with these organisms and with the chemical processes the worms maintained in the deep desert produced, through a cycle of astonishing complexity that took centuries for imperial scientists to even partially map. The orange-red powder called melange that had become the single most valuable substance in human civilization. The relationship between the sandworms and the spice was therefore not incidental. It was foundational. Remove the worms and the spice cycle collapsed. Introduce sufficient water into the deep desert and the worms died, their sand trout larval forms unable to survive the conditions that open water created. The ecology of Arrakis was not simply an environment in which spice was produced. It was, in a very precise biological sense, a machine for producing spice, and the sandworm was both its engine and its guardian. Every attempt in the 10,000 years of imperial exploitation to cultivate melange off-planet, to replicate the conditions of its production in controlled environments on other worlds, had failed completely, and the Guild's navigators, who required the spice in quantities that increased as their biological transformation deepened, had ensured through every means available to them that this state of affairs was clearly understood by anyone who might be tempted to risk the experiment carelessly. Into this environment, in an era that the Fremen themselves could not precisely date, but which imperial historians estimated at somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides, came the people who would become the Fremen. They had not been called by that name when they arrived. They had been, in their earliest recorded identity, a wandering people known as the Zen-Sunni, a religious and cultural designation that combined elements of Zen Buddhist philosophy with Sunni Islamic theology in a synthesis born of centuries of diaspora and persecution and forced migration across multiple worlds. The Zen-Sunni were not conquerors. They were survivors, and there is a profound difference between those two categories, a difference that shapes everything about how a people moves through the world and what they carry with them and what they are willing to endure. They had been slaves, or near slaves, on at least 2 worlds before they reached Arrakis, and the memory of that servitude was not something they had allowed themselves to forget, because the memory of what one has survived is, for people who have survived very hard things, among the most sacred possessions available. They arrived on Arrakis, which the rest of the universe had largely written off as useful only for the spice its surface produced, and the brutal labour that extraction required, and they looked at the desert that had killed so many before them, and they made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not a decision recorded in any official imperial document, but a quiet, collective, generational decision that would prove to be among the most consequential in human history. They decided to stay. They decided to learn. They decided that the desert was not an obstacle to survival, but the very medium of it, and that to live on Arrakis was not a matter of enduring its conditions, but of becoming, over enough generations, something the desert had shaped entirely for its own purposes. The adaptation they undertook was biological and cultural and spiritual simultaneously, as the most complete forms of human adaptation always are. The still suit, which would become perhaps the most iconic artifact of Fremen civilization in the eyes of the outside universe, was not simply a technological solution to the problem of water loss in an arid environment. It was a philosophical statement. It said, in the eloquent language of engineering and daily practice, that the human body was worth preserving precisely and entirely because water was so rare, and that the water contained within a human body was, in the most literal possible sense, sacred. The Fremen phrase, "his water belongs to the tribe," spoken at the death of any freemen, and the practice of reclaiming that water from the dead, is one that strikes outsiders as grotesque, and one that strikes any person who has spent sufficient time understanding the depth of Fremen water theology as one of the most profound expressions of community and continuity that human civilization has ever produced. For water on Arrakis was not merely scarce in the way that certain commodities on other worlds were scarce. Water was the organizing principle of Fremen civilization. It was their currency and their cosmology, their sacrament and their measure of value, their deepest metaphor for life and hope and the future they intended to build. In the vast underground cisterns called setches, carved into the rock beneath the desert surface over generations of patient labour, the Fremen stored water in quantities that the surface-dwelling Harkonnen overlords and imperial officials who cycled through positions of authority on Arrakis never suspected. The accounting of that water, the gradual accumulation of it toward a goal so vast and so long-term that it had long since passed from strategic planning into the territory of religious myth, was the great secret project of the Fremen people, and its completion was the dream that had sustained them through 10,000 years of desert living and periodic persecution. That dream had a name: terraforming. The Fremen, guided in their earliest generations on Arrakis by an ecologist prophet whose identity and teachings had by Paul's time been compressed and mythologized into the figure called Shai-Hulud's servant, had been engaged in a systematic multi-generational project to transform Arrakis into a world capable of supporting open water. They had been planting wind traps to capture atmospheric moisture. They had been introducing carefully selected plant species into sheltered areas. They had been managing the desert's ecology with the patient precision of people who understood that they would not live to see the outcome of their work, and who found in that understanding not despair but a particular form of devotion, the devotion of those who plant trees under whose shade they know they will never sit. The Fremen culture that had grown around this project and around the necessities of desert survival was one of the most internally coherent and psychologically sophisticated cultures in the known universe, and this is a statement that deserves to be received with the full weight of what it implies, given that the known universe contained, by Paul's era, hundreds of distinct human civilizations across as many worlds. The Fremen were not primitive. They were not, as the Harkonnen administrators who exploited the planet's spice wealth typically characterized them, simply barbaric desert people whose occasional violent resistance to imperial authority was the predictable behavior of uncivilized populations. They were, in the most precise possible sense, a civilization in perfect equilibrium with the most demanding environment that human beings had ever chosen to inhabit, and their apparent simplicity, their small numbers and their cave-dwelling habits, and their lack of interest in the technological display that marked imperial wealth and power, was not poverty. It was the specific and deliberate aesthetic of a people who had learned, over many thousands of years, to carry nothing that the desert would use against them. Their spiritual life was equally precise and equally adapted to its environment. The Fremen religion, which the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had, in an act of deliberate and calculating cultural engineering, seeded with messianic prophecies over many generations, was a fusion of their original Zensuni beliefs with the particular philosophical demands of desert existence. It was a religion that honoured the sandworms as divine, that understood death as a return of water to the community, that located holiness not in any transcendent realm, but in the specific physical daily practices of survival, and that looked forward, with a faith that had been burning steadily for thousands of years, to the coming of a leader from outside the desert, an outsider who would awaken the water of life and transform the world. The Fremen called this figure the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. They had been waiting for him for a very long time, and the desert, as it had always done, was patient. The desert had shaped its people into something extraordinary, and the rest of the universe, for the most part, had not noticed. This is the particular blindness of power. The tendency of those who hold it to look at what they do not understand and see only what is useful to them, only what can be extracted and quantified and entered into a ledger. The Harkonnen, who had administered Arrakis for 80 years before the events that would change everything, had looked at the Fremen and seen a nuisance. The Emperor Shaddam IV, who sat upon the Golden Lion throne on Kaitane and received the spice tithe from Arrakis as his imperial due, had looked at the Fremen and seen very little at all. It would fall to a man of a very different temperament, a duke of the house whose sigil was a red hawk, and whose personal philosophy was built on the radical notion that a leader's first obligation was to the people he led, to look at Arrakis and see, with a clarity that would ultimately cost him everything, exactly what was there. Leto Atreides was not a simple man, and the history that produced him was not a simple history. To understand why his appointment to the governorship of Arrakis carried within it the weight of inevitability, why it felt to those who observed imperial politics closely less like an administrative reassignment and more like the slow tightening of a carefully prepared trap, one must understand something of the world he came from, and the dynasty he carried forward, and the ancient enmity that had been shaping his fate since long before his birth. House Atreides traced its lineage in the genealogical traditions that the noble houses of the Landsraad maintained with the obsessive precision of people for whom bloodline was both identity and legal argument, back to the ancient Greek kings of old Earth, specifically to the House of Atreus, whose mythological history was one of tragedy and betrayal, and the long inheritance of consequence across generations. Whether this lineage was factually accurate in every particular is a question that historians have debated without resolution for centuries. What is not debatable is that the Atreides had, over the 10,000 years of imperial civilization, cultivated a reputation that was unusual among the great houses in being built primarily on qualities that were not, strictly speaking, useful for survival in the environment of imperial politics. They were known for their honour. The word sounds simple, and in the mouths of lesser houses it was frequently deployed as a costume rather than a character, a thing said rather than a thing lived. In the case of the Atreides, and most particularly in the case of Leto, the duke who was Paul's father, it was something that functioned more like a gravitational field than a policy, a quality so deeply embedded in how the man made every decision, large and small, that those who served him felt it as a physical reality rather than an abstraction. His soldiers, the fighting force that was regarded throughout the Landsraad as among the finest in the Imperium, were loyal to him not in the way that mercenaries are loyal to the source of their wages, but in the way that people are loyal to someone who has demonstrated repeatedly and at personal cost that he considers their lives to have value. This was, in the feudal ecosystem of imperial politics, genuinely unusual. It was also, from the perspective of those who feared the Atreides, genuinely dangerous. The enmity between House Atreides and House Harkonnen was old enough that its precise origins had become a matter of competing historical accounts rather than settled record. But its practical reality in the generation of Leto and the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was vivid and unambiguous. The Baron was everything that Leto was not, and he understood this with a clarity that had long since curdled into something that the historical record is obliged to call hatred, though the word is perhaps too simple for the complex and calculating nature of what the Baron actually felt. He was a man of enormous physical bulk, a condition partly the result of a biological affliction that his wealth could manage but not cure, and of an intelligence that was as genuine as it was ruthless. A mind that saw the world as a collection of leverage points, and was perpetually engaged in the identification and exploitation of each one. He had administered Arrakis for 80 years, and had extracted from it a wealth that had made House Harkonnen one of the most powerful in the Landsraad, and he had done so with a thoroughness and a disregard for the human cost of that extraction that had made the name Harkonnen, among the freemen who survived his administration, a word spoken in the particular register reserved for things that are both despised and feared. The decision to reassign Arrakis from Harkonnen to Atreides' administration was made by the Emperor Shaddam IV, and it was not made out of any desire to reward the Atreides or to improve conditions on the planet. It was made because the Emperor was afraid. Specifically, he was afraid of a thing that imperial rulers had always feared, and that the particular character of Leto Atreides had made more acute than usual. The loyalty of an army. The Atreides fighting forces, their Sadauka rivaling soldiers trained by the weapons master Gurney Halleck and the legendary swordmaster Duncan Idaho, had grown in capability and in number to a point where the Emperor's own advisors were noting, in the careful language of people who understood that the observation itself was dangerous, that House Atreides represented a military potential that no single noble house was supposed to possess. The gift of Arrakis, with its impossible administrative challenges and its embedded Harkonnen infrastructure and its Fremen population that had resisted every previous attempt at pacification, was not a gift at all. It was an elegant and plausibly deniable method of destruction. Leto understood this. There is substantial evidence in the historical record, in the accounts of those who served him and survived what followed, that he understood it with considerable clarity, that he looked at the offer of Arrakis and saw within it the shape of the trap that had been prepared for him, and he accepted it anyway. This decision, which has been analysed by historians and philosophers and students of leadership for the millennia that followed, was not the decision of a man who had failed to understand his situation. It was the decision of a man who had calculated, with the particular kind of reasoning available to someone who places certain values above survival, that the potential of Arrakis, the possibility of an alliance with the Fremen whose true numbers and capabilities the Imperium had catastrophically underestimated, was worth the risk that acceptance entailed. He was, in this calculation, not entirely wrong. He was simply unable to account for the completeness of the betrayal that was coming, because the completeness of it required a source he had trusted absolutely. The household that made the journey from the waterworld of Caladan to the desert of Arrakis was, by any measure, a remarkable collection of human beings, and the relationships among them were of the kind that form only when people have lived through shared difficulty and arrived at a mutual understanding too deep for ordinary social categories. Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, had been with Leto since young manhood, and possessed a fighting capability so extraordinary that his name had become something approaching legend in the martial traditions of the Landsraad. Gurney Halleck, the weapons master and troubadour, carried in his scarred face the evidence of Harkonnen cruelty, having spent years in the slave pits of Gidi Prime before his rescue, and carried in his music and his poetry the evidence that cruelty had not managed to extinguish whatever it had attempted to extinguish in him. Thufir Hawat, the Mentat master of assassins, was among the most capable human computing minds in the Imperium, a man whose loyalty to the Atreides had been the organising principle of his professional life for decades, And then there was Jessica. Lady Jessica, the bound concubine of Duke Leto Atreides and the mother of his son, was a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother in training, a woman whose capabilities extended so far beyond the ordinary as to make the word woman feel, in certain contexts, like a category error. She had been placed with Leto by the Sisterhood as part of their breeding program, the centuries-long genetic project through which the Bene Gesserit were attempting to produce a super being they called the Kwisatz Haderach, a male who could access the genetic memories available to female Reverend Mothers, and whose prescient awareness would be the most powerful human consciousness ever produced. Jessica had been instructed by the Sisterhood to produce a daughter, whose own breeding with a specific Fremen genetic line would take the program one step closer to its goal. She had instead produced a son. She had done so, she would eventually acknowledge, for love, because she had wanted to give Leto an heir, and this act of personal devotion over institutional obedience was one of the most consequential decisions in human history, though it would be years before the full weight of its consequences became visible. The boy Paul was 15 years old when the household made its journey from Caladan to Arrakis, and he was already, by every measure available to those who observed him, something that did not fit comfortably into ordinary categories. His mother had trained him in the Bene Gesserit disciplines, the voice, the precise muscular control, the capacity for observing and reading human behavior with an accuracy that most people found unsettling when they became aware of it. His father had given him the ethical and strategic education of a duke's heir, including the painful lessons about the weight of responsibility and the human cost of command decisions. And something else was at work in him, something neither his training nor his education had produced, a quality of awareness that arrived sometimes as a pressure behind the eyes and sometimes as an image that felt more like memory than imagination, fragments of possible futures appearing in his sleeping and waking mind with an insistence that he had not yet learned to interpret or to trust. Arrakis received the Atreides in the way that it received everything, with heat and silence and the ancient impartial patience of a world that had outlasted everything anyone had ever tried to do to it. The city of Arrakeen, the administrative capital, was a place of heavy walls and dust-filtered light, its architecture designed entirely around the management of heat and the prevention of water loss. Beautiful in the specific way that things shaped entirely by necessity are beautiful, without ornament, without excess, every line and surface performing exactly the function it was built to perform and nothing more. The spice, that particular rust-red tinge in the air and the dust and the fabric and the food, was present before they landed, perceivable at the edges of consciousness as a subtle sharpening of sensory detail, a faint extension of what felt possible to notice and to think. Paul breathed it in and felt something shift in the interior architecture of his awareness, something quiet and immense, like a door opening at the far end of a long corridor, too distant to see through, but undeniably irrevocably open. The trap, when it closed with a totality that only the most carefully prepared betrayals achieve. The source was Wellington Yue, the Atreides household physician, a man who held the imperial conditioning that was supposed to make betrayal by a Suk doctor a practical impossibility, a guarantee so absolute that its existence was itself a form of security. The conditioning had been broken in the manner that the Baron Harkonnen had invested considerable resources in discovering, through the leverage of someone Yue loved more than he feared his own integrity. What he delivered to the Harkonnen and their Imperial Sardaukar allies was not simply the location of the Duke or the timing of the assault. What he delivered was the completeness of surprise, the one element that all of Thufir Hawat's Mentat calculations and all of Gurney Halleck's defensive preparations had been constructed on the assumption they would never face. The night the Harkonnen came, they came with Sardaukar soldiers disguised in Harkonnen livery, an act of imperial involvement that was simultaneously obvious to anyone who examined the evidence carefully, and entirely deniable in any formal political context. Leto died as he had lived, attempting to take with him the architect of the catastrophe, a plan that came very close to succeeding and did not succeed, and whose failure was complete and without ambiguity. The household was scattered. Hawat was captured and turned against his own through the application of a slow poison and a carefully constructed lie about Jessica's role in the betrayal. Idaho died buying time for Jessica and Paul to escape into the desert, his last stand the kind of thing that soldiers speak of in the registers, reserved for acts that exceed the ordinary category of bravery and become something closer to the final, complete expression of a human being's deepest nature. And Jessica and Paul ran into the darkness, into the sand, into the desert that had been waiting, with the patience of 10,000 years, for exactly this moment. The desert received them without ceremony, which is to say, it received them the way it received everything, with complete indifference to their names and their histories and the magnitude of what they had just lost, with the same silence it had offered to every living thing that had ever fled into its darkness, seeking refuge or simply seeking distance from something unbearable. Jessica and Paul ran from the burning ruin of what had been an Atreides' future, and the sand accepted their footprints and erased them. And the night air, cold in the way that desert nights are cold, with a severity that feels like a personal affront after the brutality of the day's heat, pressed against them and asked nothing of them except that they keep moving, keep breathing, remain alive in the most immediate and unglamorous sense of those words, because the desert had no interest in grief and no patience for stillness that was not the stillness of something already dead. Jessica was injured. This is a detail that the mythology that grew around these events would later tend to minimize, because mythology has a general preference for its central figures to be unambiguously capable from the first moment of their emergence. But the historical record is clear that the woman who fled into the Arrakeen desert that night was carrying physical damage alongside the weight of a grief so total that it constituted its own kind of wound, a grief that she could not afford to feel with any completeness, because the boy running beside her needed her to be functional, needed her to be the Bene Gesserit trained operative whose capabilities exceeded what an injured, bereaved woman ought to be able to produce, and so she was that. And the grief waited as grief is willing to do, patient as the desert itself, for a moment that would not arrive for a very long time. Paul ran beside her, and within him the pressure that had been building since his first breath of Arrakeen air was doing something new. The dreams that had visited him with increasing frequency in the weeks since their arrival, those fragments of possible futures with their quality of memory rather than imagination, were reorganizing themselves around the specific reality of this night, this sand, this direction of flight, and the reorganization carried with it a sensation that he would later describe in the language available to a 15-year-old boy who had not yet developed the vocabulary for what was happening to his consciousness, as something like falling and something like waking simultaneously, as though the floor of ordinary awareness had given way beneath him, and he was descending into a space that was larger on the inside than anything he had been told the inside of a human mind could contain. He did not yet understand what he was. He had the shape of the understanding without its content, the way one sometimes wakes from a dream, certain that something important has been revealed and unable to retrieve the specific words of the revelation. They survived the first night through a combination of Jessica's training and Paul's rapidly activating capabilities and the fundamental Bene Gesserit philosophy toward survival, which approached the problem not as a matter of courage or willpower, but as a matter of attention, the discipline of noticing precisely what the environment required and providing exactly that and nothing more, wasting nothing, performing every action with the economy of movement that the desert rewarded and the desert's opposite punished. They had been given, in the chaos of the betrayal, and through Yue's ambiguous final act of partial redemption, a thumper and basic survival equipment, and they had the still suits whose technology Jessica understood in sufficient detail to ensure they wore them correctly, and they had the Bene Gesserit training that was, in its deepest practical application, a survival technology as sophisticated as anything the desert required them to possess. What they did not have, and what they needed with an urgency that the desert would not allow them to defer for long, was a destination. The desert was not survivable indefinitely by people who did not know its specific geography, who did not know the locations of the sietches where the Fremen lived, and the wind traps where atmospheric moisture was collected, and the routes between them that the Fremen had been maintaining and memorizing for thousands of years. Paul carried within him, from his pre-Arrakis education, and from the briefings that had accompanied the Atreides transition planning, a partial map of this geography, enough to give them a direction, if not a certainty, and it was toward the deep desert, toward the area of Fremen concentration that Imperial surveys had always systematically underestimated, that they moved through the remaining hours of darkness with the particular quality of purposeful urgency that is the only psychologically sustainable form of urgency available to people in genuine mortal danger. The Fremen found them before they found the Freemen. This is the way it almost always happened, and it reflects something essential about the relationship between the desert and its people, which is that the desert belonged to the Fremen in the most complete sense, not in any legal or administrative sense that imperial documents would recognize, but in the sense that every shift of sand and every change in wind and every track left by any living creature moving across its surface was information that the Fremen read with the fluency of people for whom the desert was not an environment to be navigated, but a language in which they were native speakers. A Sietch leader named Stilgar, whose quality of stillness and whose eyes that had been bleached entirely blue by a lifetime of melange consumption, gave him the appearance of someone who had arrived at a place beyond ordinary human agitation, was the first Fremen of consequence to look at Paul Atreides with real attention, and what he saw gave him pause in the manner of a man who has been told by a deep and reliable part of his own judgment that he is looking at something significant without yet knowing what form that significance will take. The encounter that followed was one of those moments in which the mechanisms of destiny and the mechanics of ordinary human interaction occupy the same space simultaneously, each proceeding by its own logic, while producing a result that neither logic alone could have arrived at. Stilgar's people were prepared in the initial instance of the contact to kill them. This was not cruelty. It was the straightforward operational logic of a people who had survived 10,000 years in an environment that did not forgive the kind of carelessness that allowing unknown outsiders to observe the location of a Sietch would represent. What stayed their hands in those initial instants was a combination of things: Jessica's immediate and fluent deployment of the Bene Gesserit Missionaria Protectiva. The body of carefully implanted mythology the sisterhood had seeded into Fremen culture over generations specifically to create precisely this kind of protective reflexive hesitation in the presence of a Bene Gesserit woman and her male companion, and Paul's response to the physical challenge that was offered to him. A response whose quality of movement and whose outcome produced in Stilgar the particular expression of a man whose working assumptions have just been quietly revised. The Missionaria Protectiva is worth dwelling upon, because its existence reveals something about the Bene Gesserit that is simultaneously impressive and deeply troubling, a window into the organization's relationship to power and to the people it considered pieces in its long generational game rather than human beings with their own interior lives and their own right to form their beliefs without manipulation. For centuries, Bene Gesserit sisters had been moving through the populations of vulnerable and isolated human communities, including the Fremen of Arrakis, and had been seeding into their oral traditions and their religious frameworks specific mythological structures, specific prophecies with specific characteristics, designed to ensure that a Bene Gesserit woman, arriving in extremity among such a people, would find, already prepared in their belief system, a place of safety, a role of reverence, a set of expectations that she could step into and embody. It was, from a purely operational standpoint, extraordinarily effective. It was also a form of manipulation that treated the Fremen's deepest spiritual convictions as a tool, as a mechanism to be engineered for the sisterhood's benefit, and this fact would carry its own long consequences forward into a future that the sisterhood had not fully modelled. Jessica stepped into the prepared space in Fremen mythology with the precision and the slightly hollow feeling that accompanies performing a role one has been trained for in a context one did not fully anticipate, and the Fremen who observed her saw what the Missionaria Protectiva had prepared them to see, and the tension of that first encounter settled into something that was not quite safety, but was meaningfully different from immediate death. Paul moved beside her into this new reality and continued doing the thing that his consciousness had been doing since they entered the desert, which was the thing he could not entirely control and could not entirely explain, the reaching forward into probability, the reading of the shapes of possible futures with an accuracy that was growing. With each hour he spent breathing the spice-saturated air of the deep desert, an accuracy that was beginning to feel less like a gift and more like a weight. The Sietch that received them was Sietch Taba, and Stilgar was its Naib, its leader. A man who wore his authority the way the desert wore its dunes, without announcement, without the need for external confirmation, as a simple property of his nature made evident by every small action and every silence. The Sietch was a world that existed entirely underground, carved into the rock of the desert floor over generations of patient labour, its chambers and tunnels lit by phosphorescent sources and warmed by the bodies of the hundreds of people who lived within it, its air carrying the deep compound smell of melange and human habitation, and the specific mineral quality of rock that has been shaped by careful hands over a very long time. For Paul, descending into it for the first time, it was both entirely foreign and, in a way that his dreams had been preparing him for without his conscious awareness, entirely familiar, the way a place can be familiar when one has dreamed of it repeatedly, without recognizing the dream as anything other than the ordinary strangeness of sleep. The process of Paul's acceptance into Freeman society was not instantaneous, and the history that compressed it into a single moment of recognition does the actual texture of that process a disservice. There was a period of testing, formal and informal, in which the Freemen assessed the outsiders with the thoroughness of people who had survived by being very careful about who they allowed inside their physical and social perimeters. Paul was assessed as a fighter, and was found to be something beyond what the assessment had expected to find. He was assessed as a potential member of the community, a more complex evaluation that had less to do with capability than with character, with the specific quality of attention he paid to the people around him, and the specific quality of respect he showed for customs he did not yet fully understand. And here too the assessment returned results that were not what a 15-year-old outsider boy might have been expected to produce. Jessica's assessment was of a different order entirely. Among the Fremen, the Reverend Mothers, the women who held the deepest religious and pharmacological knowledge of the Sietch, occupied a position of authority that ran parallel to the military authority of the Naib, and was in certain contexts superior to it. The Reverend Mother of Sietch Taba was an elderly woman named Romalo, and she was dying, and she had been waiting, in the way that the deeply old wait for things whose timing they cannot control, but whose eventual arrival they have long since accepted as certain, for someone who could take from her what she carried, the accumulated other memory of every Reverend Mother who had come before her, the vast interior chorus of female voices and female experience stretching back through the generations, which could only be transmitted through the agony of the spice ritual, and which required a recipient whose biological and psychological capacity was sufficient to survive the transmission. She looked at Jessica, and she knew. And Jessica, looking back at her, understood what was being asked, and what it would cost, and agreed, because agreement was the only thing that the moment allowed. The transformation that Jessica underwent in the spice ritual, the details of which belong properly to the next chapter of this history, was the moment at which the personal story of a woman fleeing the destruction of everything she had built her life around became something larger and stranger, and more consequential than any personal story can contain. She entered the ritual as the bound concubine of a dead duke, as a Bene Gesserit who had broken her order's instructions for love, and was now living in the full weight of the consequences of that choice. She emerged from it as something the desert had a name for, a name that carried within it the entire history of the Fremen's spiritual life and their long, patient waiting, a name that meant, in the deep language of Chakobsa, not just a title, but a recognition, the acknowledgement that what had arrived was what had always been coming. And in her womb, already formed past the point of change, already dreaming her own particular version of the futures that were beginning to accumulate around this family like sand around a fixed and immovable stone, was a daughter. Her name would be Aliyah, and she had heard everything. Aliyah had heard everything, and the weight of the everything would not become fully visible for years, but it was there from the first breath she drew in the world outside her mother's body, present in the quality of her attention and the particular stillness of her infant gaze, a stillness that the Fremen women who assisted at her birth noted with the unease they expressed in the careful language of people who have been taught by their religion to recognize the sacred and who are not entirely certain that the sacred, when it arrives in its true form, is comfortable to be near. She was born into the Sietch as her mother was still recovering from the transformation the spice ritual had worked upon Jessica's consciousness, and the two of them, mother and daughter, lay in the close warm darkness of the rock chambers, while outside the desert continued its ancient indifferent business, and inside Paul was becoming something the desert had a specific and waiting name for. Though he did not yet know it by that name and would not for a little while longer be entirely willing to accept it. The transformation of Paul Atreides into Muad'Dib was not an event. This is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about the 2 years he spent among the Fremen before the convergence that would change the shape of human civilization, and it is the thing that the mythologies which accumulated around him most consistently failed to represent accurately, preferring as mythologies always do the dramatic singular moment of transformation over the slow and unglamorous and deeply uncomfortable reality of a gradual becoming. Paul did not arrive in the desert as a boy, and emerge from a tent one morning as a messiah. He arrived as a boy with an unusual mind and an unusual training and an unusual relationship to time, and he became, through 2 years of grinding daily immersion in the hardest school that human civilization had ever produced, something that the word Messiah is perhaps the least adequate available description of, though it is the one that history settled on and has been unable to relinquish. The Fremen taught him the desert in the way that the desert required to be learned, which is to say entirely and without abstraction, without the comfortable distance of theory or the safety net of incomplete commitment. He learned to read the sand the way Stilgar read it, as a living text in which every grain displacement and every surface ripple and every change in the quality of the wind carried specific and actionable information about what was present and what was approaching, and what the next hours would require of anyone who wished to remain alive within them. He learned the rhythms of sandworm movement, the deep subsonic frequencies that preceded their approach, the specific pattern of walking that the Fremen called the sand walk, a shuffling, arrhythmic gait that produced no regular vibration and therefore attracted none of the worm's territorial attention. He learned the water disciplines of the stillsuit with the thoroughness that Fremen children learned them, not as a technology but as a practice, a form of bodily consciousness as continuous and as unconsciously maintained as breathing. He learned Chakobsa, the Fremen language, with a speed that the Fremen found remarkable, and that was, in fact, the product of the same Bene Gesserit linguistic training that had given him the capacity to hear and reproduce the precise, phonetic structures of any spoken language with a facility that his teachers experienced as uncanny. Language is not merely vocabulary and grammar, it is a way of organizing perception, a set of categories that determine what is noticeable, and what is sayable, and therefore what is thinkable in the particular way that any given culture has developed for thinking about the world. As Paul's Chakobsa deepened from functional communication into genuine fluency, something shifted in how he perceived Arrakis itself, the desert becoming legible to him in categories and distinctions that had no equivalent in the Galak of the Imperium, the names the Fremen had for specific qualities of sand and specific formations of dune, and specific states of light and wind, not translating into the language he had grown up in because the experiences they described had never been important enough to people who did not live on Arrakis to require names. He also learned to fight in the Fremen way, which was a different thing from what Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho had taught him, not in degree but in kind. The Atreides sword training had been comprehensive and excellent, and had produced in Paul a capability that had already surprised Fremen fighters in the assessment encounters of his early weeks in the Sietch, but the Fremen style of combat, shaped by generations of people for whom fighting was a regular practical necessity, rather than a martial art maintained for its own excellence, had a specificity and an economy that his previous training had not included. It was built around the stillsuit as a constraint, around the absolute conservation of energy that the desert demanded, around the Christ knife, the blade made from the tooth of a sandworm, which the Freeman carried as both weapon and sacred object, and which could be drawn only with the intention of using it, because to draw a Christ knife without drawing blood was an act of spiritual violation that the Fremen relationship with Shai-Hulud would not tolerate. The Christ knife Paul was eventually given was a fixed blade, not the more common unfixed type that degraded outside the desert's magnetic field, and its presentation was a moment of social significance within Sietch Taba that marked a threshold in his acceptance that no formal ceremony could have accomplished as completely. Among the Fremen, objects were not given lightly because the desert had made the Fremen people for whom the category of possessions was very small and therefore very serious, each owned thing being the survivor of a long process of elimination in which everything that could not justify its weight and its water cost had been discarded. To be given a Christ knife was to be told, in the eloquent language of Fremen material culture, that one's presence had been assessed and found to belong, that the Setch considered its safety no more compromised by one's knowledge of its location and its members than by the knowledge held by any other member. which is to say that one had been trusted with something that the Fremen did not give to people they expected to betray them. Alongside the practical education of desert survival, something else was happening in Paul that had no teacher and no curriculum and no precedent in any tradition he had been raised within, though it had a name in the Bene Gesserit tradition that his mother had not yet spoken to him directly, and a name in the Fremen tradition that the people around him were increasingly, quietly, beginning to apply. The prescience that had been activating since his arrival on Arrakis was deepening and broadening with each month of spice-saturated existence, and the quality of what it showed him was changing in ways that he found more disturbing rather than less, as his ability to understand what he was seeing improved. A less capable mind might have been able to hold the visions at a comfortable distance, to treat them as interesting anomalies rather than genuine information about the shape of what was coming. Paul's mind was not a less capable mind. He understood what he was seeing with a precision that made comfort impossible. What he saw in the visions that came to him in sleep, and increasingly in waking moments of stillness, was a jihad. Not as a metaphor, not as a political movement that might involve some violence in its early stages, but as a thing of specific and overwhelming scale, a wave of religious war that would move outward from Arrakis in the name of Muad'Dib, and would carry destruction across the human universe on a scale that the word war is insufficient to contain. He saw worlds burning. He saw populations displaced and destroyed in numbers that his mind presented to him not as statistics, but as specific images, faces and landscapes, and the particular quality of light in places he had never visited, rendered in the hyper-real clarity that the prescient vision always possessed. A clarity more precise than ordinary sight in the way that something seen in the moment before catastrophe is sometimes seen more clearly than anything seen in safety. He saw all of this, and he understood that it was not inevitable in the absolute sense, that the future was not a fixed architecture but a probability space in which certain paths were far more likely than others, and that the path leading to the jihad was the one that nearly every action available to him in the present moment seemed to be pointing toward. This knowledge sat in him alongside everything else. The grief for his father that he had not had space to feel completely, the responsibility for his mother and the unborn sister, whose existence had been revealed by the spice ritual, the daily demands of learning and proving and belonging in Sietch Tabr, the growing relationship with a young Fremen woman named Chani, the daughter of the ecologist Liet Kynes, whose own death in the desert had added another name to the long list of those who had been destroyed by the Harkonnen and Imperial machinery. Chani was, in the prescient visions, a constant presence, her face appearing with the frequency and the specificity of someone who would be woven into whatever future he moved toward, regardless of which path he chose, and the reality of her in the daily life of the Sietch matched the visions in a way that the visions did not always match daily reality, which is to say, she was entirely herself and entirely surprising within that continuity, a person rather than a symbol, even when the symbol-making apparatus of the prophetic tradition was attempting to make her one. The relationship between Paul and the Fremen mythology that the Missionaria Protectiva had prepared for him was one that he navigated with a discomfort that he kept largely internal, because the internal space of a Bene Gesserit-trained mind is very large and very disciplined. He understood, as his mother understood, that the prophecies the Fremen held were not genuine revelation but manufactured leverage, sisterhood engineering dressed in the language of the sacred, and this understanding created in him a moral difficulty that had no clean resolution. The prophecies were working. They were creating a space of protection and authority for him, and for Jessica, within Freeman society that no amount of combat capability or linguistic fluency alone could have produced. To repudiate them would be to lose that protection, and to damage something in the Fremen's spiritual life that, manufactured though its origin was, had become genuinely real in its effect on the people who held it. To embrace them fully was to participate in a deception of people he was coming to care about, people whose trust he was, in some sense, receiving under false pretenses. He did neither, exactly, and both, approximately, which is the kind of answer that only people comfortable with moral ambiguity can sustain over any length of time, and which Paul was increasingly capable of sustaining, because the prescience was teaching him something that no amount of ethical training had prepared him for, which is that the categories of true and false, real and constructed, become considerably less stable when one can see the probability distributions of multiple futures simultaneously. if the prophecy was manufactured, but its effects on human behaviour were real. And if those real effects were moving human behaviour toward outcomes that the prescience suggested would include the jihad whether or not he cooperated with the prophecy's narrative, then the question of whether to embrace or repudiate it became less a moral question and more a question about which form of the future one preferred to inhabit, and the futures available to him contained very little that invited preference. Among the freemen, his name changed. He had been Paul Atreides on Caladan, the Duke's heir, and in the Shetch he was given a Fremen name in the ceremony that marked the crisp-knife presentation, a name chosen by the process through which Fremen names were always chosen, from the specific qualities of the person as observed by those who had lived alongside them long enough to see past the surfaces. They named him Usul, meaning the base of the pillar, a private name for use within the Sietch, indicating something they had observed in him that corresponded to their sense of foundation, of quiet and immovable support. And they named him, for use in the wider world, Muad'Dib, after the small desert mouse that the freemen regarded with a particular affection, a creature that had survived the desert's harshness not through power, but through perfect adaptation, through the complete and intelligent internalization of what the desert required. The mouse that leapt, that moved in darkness, that survived where survival seemed impossible. Paul accepted both names and wore them alongside the name he had been born with. 3 names for 3 layers of a self that was becoming more complex with each passing month of desert life, and spice exposure, and prescient deepening, and the name Muad'Dib began, quietly, to fit him in the way that names fit people when the name and the person have grown toward each other from their separate origins and arrived, without ceremony, at correspondence. The name had found its person, and the person was still becoming what the name described, and the desert watched this becoming with the same patience it brought to everything, measuring time not in the anxious human units of days and appointments and deadlines, but in the deep geological rhythms of dune migration and sandworm territory and the slow accumulation of moisture in the wind traps that the Fremen had been building and tending and trusting for 10,000 years. Paul wore his names and continued his education and continued watching the probability space of the future, with the particular quality of dread that belongs to someone who can see a great wave approaching from a very long distance and has not yet determined whether any action available to them will be sufficient to alter its course. But the desert was also teaching him something about dread itself, something the Fremen had encoded in their deepest philosophical traditions, and that he was absorbing not through formal instruction, but through the daily practice of living among people who had made a functional peace with the inhospitable, which is that dread, held without resolution, eventually becomes something quieter and more sustainable, something that the Bene Gesserit litany against fear had gestured toward without fully capturing, a state of clear-eyed continuance that is not the absence of knowledge of danger, but the decision to act despite it, and within it, and in full acknowledgement of it. The Fremen were at war, and had been at war, in the particular low-intensity sustained way of a guerrilla people fighting and occupying power, for the entire duration of the Harkonnen administration, and before it, for as long as any living Fremen could remember, and as long as their oral histories extended, which was a very long time indeed. The war they fought was not the war that imperial military doctrine recognized as war. It had no front lines, and no formal declarations, and no pitched battles of the kind that the Sardaukar and the Harkonnen shock troops had been trained and equipped to fight and win. It was instead a war of patience and precision, of small engagements chosen with exquisite care for their favourable odds, and abandoned without shame when the odds shifted, of harassment and attrition, and the long, slow bleeding of an occupying force's resources and morale, conducted by fighters who knew every metre of the terrain, and who could disappear into it in ways that left no trace for any pursuing force to follow. The Freemen had been making the desert work for them in this way for generations, and the Harkonnen administration, which had never made any serious attempt to understand the people it administered beyond the minimum necessary to extract from them the labour and the compliance it required, had consistently and catastrophically underestimated both the scale and the capability of what it was fighting. Paul entered this war as a participant before he had fully completed his transformation into a leader of it, which is the correct order for such things. Because leadership that has not been preceded by genuine participation in the difficulty being led carries within it a hollowness that experienced people can detect, and that undermines the authority it attempts to project. He went on raids. He learned the specific mathematics of Fremen ambush, the careful calculation of engagement distance and escape route, and the precise moment at which a retreating Harkonnen patrol became a pursuing one, and the calculation therefore changed. He learned what it felt like to be genuinely afraid, in the specific physical way of someone in immediate mortal danger, and to act through that fear with the Bene Gesserit techniques that transform the body's alarm response into a sharpening of perception rather than a degradation of it, and to emerge from the action on the other side changed in the small cumulative ways that combat changes people who survive it repeatedly, depositing in them a knowledge that no training can replicate because its authority comes entirely from its having been real. Stilgar watched all of this with the attention of a man who had been leading people in difficult circumstances for long enough to know precisely what he was looking at when he saw it. He was not a simple man, and the historical treatments of him that reduced him to the loyal lieutenant, the devoted follower of the Messiah figure, did him a considerable injustice that he himself would have dismissed with the particular Fremen expression for something so far beneath serious consideration as to not merit a complete sentence. He was a leader of his own authority and his own considerable depth, a man who had kept Sietch Tabr functional and its people alive through years of Harkonnen pressure and internal challenges, and the ordinary unrelenting difficulty of desert existence, and his assessment of Paul was conducted from the position of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain from self-deception, and was therefore capable of seeing clearly. What he saw developing in the young Atreides was, he acknowledged to himself with the careful reluctance of a man who did not make large assessments casually, something that exceeded the category of talented outsider who had learned to survive the desert. It was something that the Fremen religious tradition had a name for, a name Stilgar was not yet ready to speak aloud, because speaking it aloud would change the social reality of the Sietch in ways that could not be undone. The ecological dimensions of Arrakis were present in Paul's developing understanding as a constant undercurrent, fed by two distinct streams. The first was the legacy of Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist whose vision of a transformed Arrakis had been the organizing myth of Freeman civilization for a generation, and whose death in the desert at Harkonnen hands had made him a martyr, whose ideas now carried the additional authority of blood. Paul had absorbed Kynes' terraforming vision through Chani, who was Kynes' daughter, and who carried her father's knowledge not as abstract theory, but as the inherited practical wisdom of someone who had grown up watching a parent spend a life in service to an idea large enough to outlast any individual life. The vision was this: Arrakis could be transformed. With sufficient water introduced into the planetary hydrological cycle, with the careful placement of windbreaks, and the patient cultivation of moisture-retaining plant species in the sheltered areas, with the management of the sand trout that sequestered water in the deep desert to maintain the sandworm's preferred arid conditions, the desert could, over a period of several hundred years, be made to bloom. The Fremen had been working toward this transformation for centuries with the faith of people who understood that the most important work is always the work whose completion one will not live to see. The second stream of ecological understanding came from Paul's own prescient awareness, which had begun to show him the planetary system of Arrakis not just as a backdrop to human events, but as a participant in them, a living system whose behaviour was as consequential to the futures he could see as any human political decision. He could see in the probability space of the visions what a transformed Arrakis would mean for the spice cycle, because the sandworms required the desert conditions that the terraforming would eliminate, and the spice required the sandworms, and the guild required the spice, and the entire imperial civilization required the guild, and therefore the transformation of Arrakis from desert to garden was not simply an ecological project but a political weapon of civilizational scale, the ability to threaten the destruction of the spice supply, the single piece of leverage that could move the unmovable weight of 10,000 years of imperial power structure. He held this understanding carefully, the way one holds something whose full weight one is not yet ready to bear, turning it over in his mind and watching the futures it implied with the expression of someone who has discovered that the tool they needed was also, in the same gesture, the most dangerous thing they had ever touched. Chani was not a symbol to Paul, and the prescience was not the only, or even the primary reason she mattered to him. And this distinction is important enough to insist upon, because the mythological accounts of their relationship consistently collapsed her into her narrative function, the desert woman who grounds the hero, the Fremen guide who provides access to the world he needs to enter, and in doing so erased what the historical record, thin as it is in the personal register, consistently suggests was a relationship of genuine equality and genuine recognition. Two people who saw each other with unusual clarity, and found in that clarity not disappointment, but a deepening of interest. She was her father's daughter in the depth of her ecological knowledge, and in the quality of her commitment to the long Freeman project of transformation. And she was her mother's daughter in the specific desert toughness that made the Fremen women more formidable than the outside universe generally understood, having never had reason to look closely enough to understand. She was also entirely herself, which meant she was skeptical of the prophecy in which Paul was being installed as a figure, not because she lacked faith, but because she had enough intelligence and enough proximity to the mechanics of the mythological installation to notice its seams. She told him this directly in the way that Fremen directness operated, without the diplomatic cushioning that imperial court culture required, but also without aggression, simply as a statement of her honest observation delivered to someone she considered capable of receiving it, without defensive distortion. She told him she did not know if he was the Lisan al-Gaib. She told him she knew that her people needed to believe he was, that the belief served a function in the maintenance of their collective will that she would not disturb even if she could. She told him that what she knew about him from her own direct observation was that he was capable, and that he was careful, and that he cared about the people around him in a way that was not performance, and that these things were enough for her to fight beside him without requiring the larger metaphysical claim. Paul heard this and felt something settle in him that had been requiring an external pressure to remain in its position, the relief of being seen without the mythological apparatus, the specific comfort of a person who has been surrounded by projections, finally encountering someone who is looking at the actual thing rather than the shadow it casts. The 2 years in the desert were also years of organisational transformation within the Fremen resistance, and Paul's role in that transformation was neither sudden nor uncontested. The Fremen Setches were not a unified political entity with a single chain of command. They were a distributed network of largely autonomous communities connected by the shared Freeman culture and the shared project of terraforming and the shared enmity toward the Harkonnen and Imperial presence, but governed by the authority of individual naibs whose cooperation was a matter of persuasion and demonstrated capability rather than formal obligation. The idea of unifying the Setches into a coordinated fighting force with a coherent strategic vision was not new. It had been articulated before by leaders whose vision exceeded their ability to make it real, and it had failed before, for the reasons that such projects typically fail, which is that the people being asked to subordinate their autonomous authority to a larger structure need to be given something more compelling than the abstract argument for collective action. What Paul was developing through his raids and his increasing facility with Fremen culture and his growing relationship with Stilgar and with the naibs of neighbouring Sietches who began to hear reports of the outsider who had learned to walk without rhythm and who carried a crysknife that was fixed, was not a formal organisational proposal, but something more organic and more difficult to resist, a reputation of the specific kind that the Fremen respected, built on demonstrated capability and on something else, something in the quality of his presence that the Freeman religious tradition had prepared them to notice, and that his own nature, the prescience and the Bene Gesserit training, and the grief and the 2 years of desert hardening, had produced in him without his having intended to produce it. He had become, without designing it, the kind of person around whom other capable people naturally organised, not through the formal mechanisms of authority, but through the informal mechanism of trust, the quiet consensus that forms among people who have watched someone perform under pressure and arrived at the same conclusion about what they were watching. The Harkonnen were also watching, though with considerably less comprehension. The reports filtering back to Giedi Prime and to the Baron's calculating attention described an increase in the effectiveness and the coordination of Fremen resistance operations in the deep desert regions, a quality of tactical sophistication in the recent ambushes that differed from the previous pattern in ways that his military analysts noted without fully explaining. The Baron was not a man who underestimated patterns of change when his interests were engaged, and his interest in Arrakis and its spice revenues was the most sustained interest of his professional life. He assigned his nephew Rabban, whose approach to administration could be summarized as the belief that sufficient brutality applied consistently enough would eventually produce compliance, to intensify the pacification operations in the desert regions, and Rabban did as he was instructed with the thoroughness that was his genuine if narrow capability, and the Fremen absorbed the increased pressure and the desert continued, and the wind traps continued, their patient accumulation of moisture in the darkness beneath the sand. Paul stood on the edge of a great dune one evening as the sun descended toward the horizon in the particular Arrakeen sunset that turned the sky through a sequence of colours that had no equivalent on Caladan. The spice dust in the upper atmosphere refracting the light into shades of amber and deep rust and a purple that was almost violet, and he watched the shadows move across the sand in the specific way that the Freeman could read for the information it contained about wind direction and dune stability and the location of worm sign, and he watched the futures arrange and rearrange themselves in the probability space behind his eyes, and he knew that the period of becoming was nearly complete, that the convergence he had been watching approach from the distance of 2 years of desert time was now close enough to feel its specific gravity, and that whatever he chose or did not choose in the days approaching, the wave was coming. And the only remaining question was what shape it would take when it arrived. The wave arrived, as waves of that magnitude always arrive, not as a single crashing moment, but as a gathering of pressures from multiple directions simultaneously, each one individually insufficient to break what needed breaking, and together forming a force that the existing structure of things could not absorb and could not deflect, and could not, in the end, survive. Paul had watched it coming for 2 years with the particular quality of attention available to someone who can see the shapes of probable futures, and who has spent those 2 years preparing the conditions that would determine which of those shapes the arriving force would take. The preparation was complete, or as complete as any human preparation can be for events of civilizational scale, which is to say it was thorough, and it was insufficient, and it was the best that was possible, and the desert had taught him enough about the relationship between preparation and outcome to hold both of those things simultaneously, without the contradiction between them becoming unbearable. The trigger that initiated the convergence was not, in the immediate sense, Paul's choice. It came from outside, from the imperial machinery that had set the original trap, and now, in its confidence that the trap had accomplished its purpose, was making the administrative adjustments that followed a successful elimination. The Emperor Shaddam IV, satisfied that the Atreides had been destroyed as a political and military force, had directed his attention back to the larger question of Arrakis and its management, and the larger question had 2 components that were beginning to generate friction with each other in ways that required resolution. The first component was the continuing underperformance of spice production under the Harkonnen administration. Underperformance that the Guild was noting with the specific quality of institutional anxiety that an organization experiences when the single substance its entire operational existence depends upon is becoming less reliably available. The second component was the Guild's own role in what had happened to the Atreides, a role that had involved the selective limitation of the prescient navigational awareness that would otherwise have warned of the Sardaukar deployment, a limitation the Guild had agreed to as part of the arrangement and was now reconsidering in the particular way that organizations reconsider arrangements when the costs of the arrangement begin to exceed the benefits they were promised. These pressures were converging on Arrakis from above, from the level of imperial and guild politics, at the same time that something was converging on it from below, from the level of the desert floor and the CH network, and the 2 years of Fremen preparation that Paul had been part of building. The Fremen were ready in a way they had not been ready before, not simply in the sense of military preparation, though the quality and coordination of their fighting capability had reached a level that the imperial assessment had no framework for accurately measuring, but in the more fundamental sense of collective will, the sense of a people who have been waiting for something for a very long time and have now arrived at the conviction that the waiting is over. The prophecy machinery that the Missionaria Protectiva had installed and that Paul's presence had activated was performing its intended function with an effectiveness that even the Bene Gesserit, who had designed it with considerable sophistication, had not fully anticipated, because the design had not accounted for the possibility that the figure stepping into the prophetic role would be, in addition to a Bene Gesserit-trained operator, a genuine prescient whose actual capabilities exceeded the mythological template that had been prepared for him. The water of life was the threshold, and the threshold had to be crossed before anything else could happen. This is the point in the history at which the pharmacological and the spiritual and the political, converge in a single act that cannot be cleanly assigned to any one of those categories without distorting it, because it belonged fully to all of them simultaneously. The water of life was the bile of a drowned sandworm, a substance so toxic that no untransformed human nervous system could survive contact with it, a poison of such completeness that the Fremen Reverend Mothers who underwent the transformation it offered did so with the full knowledge that survival was not guaranteed, and that the process by which survival became possible involved a kind of dying, a complete dissolution of the ordinary self followed by the reconstruction of something larger and less comfortable and permanently changed. Jessica had undergone this transformation in the spice ritual of Sietch Tabr and had survived it, and what she had survived it as was a Reverend Mother of the Freemen, carrying within her the accumulated other memory of every woman who had come before her in that lineage, a vast interior chorus whose presence changed the texture of her own consciousness in ways she was still, months later, learning to navigate. What no Reverend Mother had ever done in the entire history of the practice was survive the water of life as a male. The Bene Gesserit's understanding of why this was so was precise and physiological. The transformation required the capacity to access the genetic memory of the female line and the male nervous system in the sisterhood's accumulated knowledge, lacked the biological architecture to make that access possible without total systemic collapse. The Kwisatz Haderach, the figure the sisterhood's breeding program had been working toward for 90 generations, was defined precisely by the theoretical capacity to do what no male had survived doing, to go where the Reverend Mothers could not go, to access not only the female genetic memory, but the male line as well, the dark and terrible territory that every Reverend Mother could see at the edge of her expanded awareness but could not enter. Paul understood what he was considering with complete clarity, and the prescience had shown him the outcome of the attempt with a specificity that gave him, if not comfort, at least the particular form of courage available to someone who knows what is coming and has decided that it is acceptable. He took the water of life and he died, in the functional sense that his body's systems ceased their ordinary operation, and he lay without consciousness for a period that lasted 3 days, and Chani sat beside him through those 3 days with the stillness of someone who is committed to an outcome and is not going to allow the discomfort of waiting to move her from that commitment. And she did not know, because no one knew, whether what was lying beside her was going to wake up as Paul or not wake up at all, or wake up as something that was no longer in any meaningful sense the person she had agreed to fight beside. On the morning of the 3rd day, something shifted in the quality of the stillness around him, a change so subtle that only someone who had been attending with complete focus for 72 hours would have noticed it, and Chani noticed it, and she leaned forward and Paul opened his eyes. What looked out of those eyes was Paul, and was not only Paul, was the person who had gone in, and something additional, something that had been latent in him since before his birth, since the 90 generations of Bene Gesserit selective breeding that had been converging toward this specific nervous system, now activated and integrated in a way that the water of life's alchemical violence had made possible, and that nothing else in the known universe could have accomplished. He could see, in all directions in time simultaneously, with a clarity and a range that the partial prescience of his desert years had not prepared him for, and what he saw was vast and terrible and beautiful in the way that things are sometimes beautiful when they're too large to be comfortable and too true to be denied. He saw the jihad as he had always seen it, but now, with the additional information of the transformed awareness, and the additional information did not make the jihad less likely, it made it inevitable in a way that his previous partial vision had allowed him to believe might still be navigated around. And the loss of that navigational hope was its own kind of grief, quiet and total, added to the collection of griefs he had been carrying since the night the Harkonnen came. He also saw the mechanism by which the inevitability might be shaped, which is different from being prevented, and is the only form of influence available to someone who has arrived at a genuine understanding of what inevitable means. The jihad would happen. The question that remained, the question whose answer his choices could still affect, was what the jihad would be in its aftermath, whether the violence that moved outward from Arrakis in his name would consume itself in a generation or burn for a century, whether the civilization that emerged from the other side of it would be something capable of eventually arriving at a state of greater human freedom, or something new and differently terrible. This was not a comfortable thing to hold, the knowledge that one is going to cause enormous suffering, and that the best available response to that knowledge is to cause the suffering in a way that minimizes its duration and maximizes what it makes possible afterward. Paul held it because he had no alternative to holding it, and because the desert had taught him, in 2 years of unglamorous daily instruction, that holding difficult things without the option of setting them down is simply what living sometimes requires. The news of his awakening moved through the Sietch network with the speed that important information moves through communities that have been waiting for it, which is to say almost instantaneously, and with the particular quality of transformation that information acquires when it confirms what a large number of people have been hoping to hear. The naibs of the Sietches began to gather at Sietch Taba, called by the specific frequency of signal that the Fremen used for communications of the highest significance, and they came through the desert with the efficiency of people for whom difficult journeys were a routine category of daily life, and they arrived and they looked at the figure who had survived the water of life and had emerged from 3 days of death sleep, with blue within blue eyes that were deeper than the spice saturation of 2 years of desert living should have produced, and they assessed what they were looking at with the Fremen quality of assessment, which was thorough and unsentimental and not easily fooled. What they concluded, not unanimously, and not without the internal friction that any genuine assessment produces among people who are not simply looking for permission to believe what they want to believe, was that the question the Missionaria Protectiva had planted in their collective consciousness, and that Paul's presence had been slowly answering over 2 years of demonstrated capability, was answered now in a way that the remaining skeptics could not argue with on the grounds of evidence, though some of them attempted the argument on the grounds of prudence, noting with the legitimate concern of experienced military leaders that investing the full authority of the messianic prophecy in a single figure created a strategic vulnerability of the First Order, a single point of failure that an enemy with sufficient intelligence could exploit with devastating efficiency. The argument was correct. Paul knew it was correct. He also knew, with the precision of the transformed prescience, that the alternative futures in which that vulnerability was avoided were worse in their outcomes than the futures in which it was accepted, and this was the kind of knowledge that cannot be shared without either being believed, which requires a degree of trust in the prescience that cannot be demanded, or not being believed, which settles the argument in favour of the prudent skeptic regardless of what the prescience actually shows. The gathering of the naibs was also the moment at which the full scale of what the Fremen represented as a military force became visible in a single accounting for the first time. The imperial surveys of Arrakis had consistently estimated the Fremen population at a fraction of its actual number, partly through the deliberate misdirection that the Fremen themselves maintained around their Sietch locations and population figures, and partly through the straightforward incapacity of an imperial administrative system that had never seriously attempted to understand what it was administering. The actual number of fighting-capable Fremen, organised now across the Sietch network in the loose but increasingly coherent structure that Paul and Stilgar and the cooperating naibs had been building for 2 years, was sufficient to constitute the largest single-armed force on Arrakis by an order of magnitude that made the Harkonnen garrison and the resident Sardaukar contingent look, in comparison, like the kind of force that exists for administrative purposes rather than genuine military ones. The weapons that Paul had introduced into the Freeman arsenal were the detail that transformed this numerical advantage from a guerrilla capability into something that could contest the open desert against the most feared military force in the known universe. The Mola pistols and laser guns that the Fremen had always possessed were supplemented now by the Atreides weapons caches that had survived the fall of Arrakeen, recovered through the intelligence networks that Gurney Halleck, alive in the desert with a smuggler band and found again through the probability navigating of Paul's prescience, had helped to locate. More significantly, Paul had introduced the Freeman to the military potential of the Atreides battle language, the private communication system that allowed coordinated tactical movement across distances and in conditions where open communication would compromise position, and the Fremen had learned it with the speed of people for whom operational security was not an abstract military concept, but the daily practice on which their survival had always depended. The storm that Paul had been watching in the prescient visions for 2 years was a physical storm as well as a metaphorical one, the great coronal storm that moved across the Arrakeen desert, with a destructive force that nothing human-made could withstand, and that the Fremen, who had been living in relationship with the desert's weather for 10,000 years, had learned to move with rather than against, to use as cover and concealment and operational environment, in ways that an enemy unfamiliar with its specific dynamics could not follow. Paul looked at the storm approaching on the horizon of both his physical sight and his prescient awareness, and recognized in it the convergence point he had been watching arrive, the moment at which the gathering of naibs and the awakened prescience and the Fremen military capability and the approaching imperial response to the disruption of spice production all arrived at the same point in time and space, and he gave the order, not dramatically, not with the rhetorical flourish that the mythology would later supply, but in the quiet, practical language of a military commander who has finished his preparation and is ready to begin, and the Fremen of the deep desert moved into the storm. The storm moved and the Fremen moved within it, and the two things, the natural force and the human force, became for the duration of that convergence effectively indistinguishable from each other, which was precisely the relationship the Fremen had been cultivating with their desert for 10,000 years, and which now, in the moment that all of that cultivation had been pointing toward, expressed itself with a completeness that even Paul's prescient preparation had not fully rendered in its sensory specificity. The visions had shown him outcomes. They had not shown him the particular quality of the light inside the storm, the way the spice-laden sand turned the air itself into a substance of deep amber opacity, through which the Fremen moved like shadows given purpose, their still suits sealing them against the abrasive fury of the wind, while their knowledge of the desert's specific grammar of movement allowed them to navigate by internal maps built from 10,000 years of collective memorization of every dune and rock formation and subsurface channel in the deep desert regions that the Harkonnen had never bothered to map, because they had never imagined they would need to fight there. The Battle of Arrakis, which is what the Imperial Historical Record called it, when it eventually got around to constructing a formal account of events it had very little direct information about, was not a battle in the sense that the imperial military tradition understood battles to be. It had no front line and no formal engagement, and no moment at which two armies faced each other across a defined field, and the superior force prevailed through the application of greater mass or firepower or tactical sophistication in the conventional sense of those terms. It was something that the Fremen had a more accurate word for, a word that translated approximately as the settling of accounts, implying a process that had been a long time in preparation, and that, when it finally arrived at its moment of resolution, moved with the swift inevitability of something that has been accumulating force in darkness for years, and requires only the removal of the final constraint to release everything that has been building behind it. The Sardaukar were the finest soldiers in the known universe, and this is not a statement that requires qualification or diplomatic softening. They were the product of a training system so brutal and so thorough that the Sardaukar themselves refer to their homeworld of Seleucia Secundus, the prison planet whose unlivable conditions constituted the first and most fundamental stage of their formation, as their gift, the thing that had made them what they were, by demanding that they become it or die in the attempt. The mortality rate of Sardaukar training was the detail that made every military analyst in the Landsraad deeply uncomfortable when they permitted themselves to think about it clearly, because it implied that the soldiers who survived the process had been selected not simply for capability, but for a relationship with difficulty and with death that placed them categorically outside the psychological range of ordinary military opposition. They had never, in the 10,000 years of imperial history, been defeated in open engagement by any force the Landsraad had been able to field against them, and this record of invincibility was itself a weapon, a component of the Sardaukar's effectiveness that functioned at the level of the enemy's morale before a single blade was drawn. The Fremen were not impressed by this record, and the reason they were not impressed by it illuminates something essential about what the Fremen had become in 10,000 years of desert survival. The Sardaukar's training mortality rate was high. The desert of Arrakis had a higher one. The Sardaukar had been formed by a world that tried to kill them during every stage of their development, and this formation had produced soldiers of extraordinary quality. The Fremen had been formed by a world that never stopped trying to kill them, not just during a defined period of training, but across the entirety of every life lived on Arrakis from birth to death. And this formation had produced something that the Sardaukar's assessors, working from the imperial surveys that so dramatically underestimated Fremen numbers and capability, had never had occasion to accurately evaluate. The Sardaukar were elite soldiers. The Fremen were a people for whom the condition of being elite soldiers was simply the baseline requirement for reaching adulthood. They met the Sardaukar and the Harkonnen forces in the desert, and in the streets of Arrakis and in the spaces between, and the meeting was not even in the sense that the numbers involved were not even, because the numbers were heavily in the Fremen's favour once the full scale of the Sietch network's mobilisation was understood. And it was not even in the sense that the Fremen fought on ground they had spent their entire lives learning, while their opponents fought on ground they had spent years dismissing as strategically irrelevant. The Harkonnen forces broke first, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, because the Harkonnen military culture was built on the application of overwhelming force to populations incapable of effective resistance, and the discovery that the population they had been administering was not only capable of effective resistance but was, in the specific environment of the deep desert and the storm-shrouded approaches to Arrakis, comprehensively superior to them as a fighting force, produced in their formations the particular collapse that happens when a military culture encounters something its foundational assumptions have no category for. The Sardaukar held longer, and held with the quality that their formation had always produced, which was a refusal to break that was less a matter of courage in the ordinary sense, and more a matter of having been trained in an environment where breaking was not a survival option, and where the concept of an overwhelming opponent had therefore never been allowed to develop a functional representation in their operational psychology. They held and they inflicted losses that the Fremen accepted with the Fremen relationship to loss, which was grief, yes, real grief, the water given back to the tribe in the ancient ceremony, but not the operational paralysis that grief produces in forces for whom loss is an aberration, rather than an expected cost of existence in a difficult world. And eventually, because the numbers and the terrain and the storm and the accumulated weight of 2 years of preparation were what they were, the Sardaukar lines contracted and then broke. And the settling of accounts moved into the city itself. Paul was present in this as a commander and as a fighter, and as a prescient consciousness, navigating the specific path through the probability space that minimized, within the constraints of what the jihad required, the duration of the violence and the scale of the destruction. He moved through the storm with Stilgar beside him, and Chani behind him, and the Fremen of Sietch Tabr around him, and the crysknife that had been a gift and a threshold was now a tool with the specific and serious purpose that Fremen tradition held. It was always meant to serve, and he used it with the economy and the precision of someone who had spent 2 years learning from the finest practitioners of desert combat in the known universe, and he felt each use of it with the full weight of what it was, because the Bene Gesserit training and the Freeman philosophy both agreed on the same point, which was that violence undertaken without full acknowledgement of its weight was a form of debasement that produced exactly the kind of person one should not want to be or to have become, and Paul was not going to become that person, regardless of what the jihad required of him, and this commitment was maintained at a cost that the mythology, with its preference for the hero untroubled by the consequences of heroic action, did not adequately record. The Emperor arrived at Arrakis with his full retinue and his reserve Sardaukar, and the diplomatic weight of the imperial throne, having been summoned by the collapse of the situation in a way that no amount of managed information had been able to prevent reaching Kaitain, and he arrived in the specific disposition of a man who has convinced himself that the situation is recoverable through the application of the authority he has always had available and has always found sufficient. He arrived in his great flagship. The Bene Gesserit truthsayer Gaius Helen Mohiam beside him, as she had been beside him for decades, her presence a reminder of the sisterhood's investment in the outcome of events on Arrakis, an investment that was now producing returns of a kind the sisterhood had not fully modelled when they designed the operation. The guild navigators were also represented in the particular manner of guild representation, which involved a heavily shielded tank of spice gas, within which the transformed navigator's incomprehensible form was maintained, because the guild had been watching the spice production figures with a degree of attention that had long since passed from concern into something closer to existential alarm, and the guild's presence at any significant imperial negotiation was now effectively mandatory in a way that the Emperor found constraining and that the navigators found entirely appropriate. The landing of the imperial fleet was the moment at which the political dimensions of what had been a military action became fully visible, because the fleet represented not just the Emperor's military reserve, but the full structure of the civilization that had sent it, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of imperial authority arriving at a place where that authority was about to be weighed against something it had never previously had to be weighed against. The houses of the Landsraad had also sent observers, the great political calculation of the Landsraad being that the outcome of whatever was happening on Arrakis would redistribute power in ways that affected every house, and the houses were not going to allow that redistribution to occur without their observation, and, where possible, their influence. The Guild had made clear, in the careful language of an organisation that communicates primarily through implication, that the disruption of spice production was not a situation they were prepared to allow to continue indefinitely, which in practical terms meant that the Emperor had a very limited window in which to resolve the situation, before the Guild's self-interest produced interventions that no one in the current gathering had the power to predict or to control. Paul presented himself to this convergence of imperial power with the full weight of what he had become, and the full understanding of what that weight implied for the negotiation he was about to conduct. He came with the Fremen behind him, the actual numbers of them made visible to the imperial observers for what appears to have been the first time in any formal context. The scale of the mobilization producing in the Emperor's court, the particular quality of silence that falls when a calculation has been performed, and the result is not what the calculation was expected to produce. He came with the documentation of Sardaukar involvement in the Atreides' destruction, the evidence that the Emperor's fingerprints were on what had been presented as a Harkonnen private action, and this documentation was the legal and political foundation of everything that followed, because it transformed Paul from a rebel seeking power into a wronged duke seeking justice, a category distinction that the formal structures of Landsraad law took with a seriousness that the Emperor could not simply override. He came also with the threat that the prescience had shown him was the single most effective instrument available to him, the threat to the spice itself, the capacity to seed the desert with a biological agent that would destroy the spice cycle utterly and permanently, eliminating melange production on Arrakis, and therefore eliminating the Guild's navigational capacity, and therefore collapsing interstellar civilization within a generation. It was a threat of mutual destruction, the classic form of leverage available to someone who has nothing left to lose, and Paul wielded it with the calm of someone who had spent 2 years sitting with the knowledge of its existence and deciding how he felt about using it, arriving at a conclusion that was not comfortable and was entirely settled. He would use it if he had to. He hoped he would not have to. The hope was not a weakness, and the willingness was not a bluff, and the Emperor, who had been navigating power dynamics for the entirety of his adult life, and who could recognize the difference between a performance of willingness and the actual thing, recognized what he was looking at. The resolution came in the way that resolutions come when one side has exhausted its available options, and the other side has demonstrated both the capability and the will to do what it has said it will do. The Emperor abdicated the reality of his power, while retaining for a period the formal title, a distinction that meant less with each passing day as the structural reality of the new arrangement became established. House Harkonnen ceased, in any practically meaningful sense, to exist, the Baron dead by the hand of Aliyah, who had walked onto the Imperial flagship as a child of perhaps 4 years, and had killed the most feared man in the Landsraad with a poisoned needle delivered with the precise capability of someone who was 4 years old in body and carried the accumulated knowledge of every reverend mother in the female genetic line in her mind, and whose nature was therefore one of the most unsettling things that any of the assembled imperial observers had ever encountered. The great houses looked at what had happened to the house that had crossed the Atreides and drew the conclusions that the situation invited them to draw. Paul Atreides, Duke of Arrakis, Muad'Dib of the Fremen, Kwisatz Haderach of the Bene Gesserit breeding program that had not intended to produce him in this generation, and had not intended to produce him outside of its direct control, assumed the imperial throne through the formal mechanism of betrothal to Princess Irulan, the Emperor's eldest daughter. A political marriage in the fullest and most precise sense of that term, a legal architecture for the transfer of legitimate authority that carried no personal dimension, and that both parties understood with complete clarity to be exactly and only what it was. Chani remained what she had always been, which was the person Paul had actually chosen, and the distinction between the political wife and the genuine companion was one that the imperial court would spend years trying to process through social and political frameworks that had not been designed to accommodate it. The jihad had begun in the same moment that its proximate cause had been resolved, because the wave does not stop when the initial disturbance that created it has been addressed. It continues outward through the medium it's moving through according to the physics of what it is. And what Paul had set in motion on Arrakis was moving now outward through the human universe, with the specific momentum of a religious and military force that believed itself to be the instrument of destiny, and that had, in the taking of Arrakeen and the humbling of the imperial throne, been given sufficient evidence for that belief to make any argument against it practically ineffective. He had won. He sat with the weight of that victory in the quiet centre of himself, where the prescience showed him the billions of lives that the Jihad would move through, like the desert wind moves through everything it touches, leaving the landscape changed, and not all the changes gentle, and he held the knowledge that he had done what was possible and that possible and good were not, in this instance, the same thing, and the desert outside the window was the same desert it had always been, and it did not offer him absolution, and he had not expected it to. And the spice was in the air, and the worms moved in the deep sand, and the future continued as futures do without waiting for anyone's readiness. The future continued, and Paul sat within it as emperor, and the distance between those two facts, between the abstract forward motion of time and the specific weight of being the person around whom so much of that motion was now organized, was a distance he crossed every morning upon waking and every evening before sleep, a crossing that became neither easier nor harder with repetition, but simply more familiar, the way a scar becomes familiar, present always, incorporated into the body's map of itself, no longer surprising but never entirely comfortable. The throne room of Arrakeen, which he had chosen deliberately over the traditional imperial seat of Kaiten, as a statement whose symbolic dimensions he understood completely, and whose practical implications he had calculated with the transformed prescience that saw consequences spreading outward from decisions like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, was a room designed by a people for whom grandeur was expressed through restraint, through the quality of silence and the weight of stone, and the specific quality of filtered desert light, rather than through the accumulated ornamentation of a civilization that had spent 10,000 years converting wealth into display. He governed from this room, and from the desert, and from the interior space of the prescience, 3 overlapping territories each with its own demands and its own grammar of navigation, and the governance he conducted from them was the governance of someone who could see the long-term consequences of decisions with an accuracy that made ordinary political calculation feel like an approximation so crude as to be almost meaningless. This capability, which should in theory have made governance straightforward, made it instead a particular form of suffering. Because the prescience did not show him a single future, but a probability space in which multiple futures coexisted at varying degrees of likelihood, and the decisions available to him in the present moment could shift those probabilities, but could not determine outcomes with the absolute certainty that the mythology surrounding him claimed he possessed. And this gap between the mythological emperor who knew all and the actual man who knew more than was comfortable, and less than was sufficient, was a gap he inhabited in a solitude that was not loneliness exactly, but was the specific isolation of someone whose inner experience cannot be shared with anyone who has not had the same experience, which in Paul's case meant essentially no one. Chani was the closest thing to an exception, not because she possessed prescience of her own, but because she possessed the Fremen quality of attention, the capacity for honest observation undistorted by the mythological apparatus that surrounded Paul in every other human interaction he conducted, and her presence in the private spaces of his life was the thing that most reliably returned him to the experience of being a person rather than a function. She'd given him a son, a boy named Leto, for his grandfather, and the birth of the child had produced in Paul a dimension of feeling that the prescience had shown him in outline, but whose specific texture, the particular way a new human being reorganizes the emotional architecture of the people responsible for it, had not been fully rendered in advance. The child was also, from the moment of his birth, a figure in the probability space of the prescient visions, a thread that ran forward through the futures, with a significance that Paul observed with the careful attention of a father who is also a prophet, and who is therefore obliged to look at his own child with a quality of assessment that no parent should have to bring to the fact of their child's existence. The Jihad moved outward through the human universe, and Paul received its reports with the full knowledge of what they meant, and with the full inability to stop what he had started and could now only attempt to shape. Freeman warriors carrying the green and black banner of Muad'Dib, and the religious conviction of a people who had waited 10,000 years for the moment they were now living, moved across world after world with the specific efficiency of fighters who had been formed by the hardest environment in the known universe, and who believed, with the complete and unambiguous faith that only genuine religious conviction produces, that they were doing the work of something larger than themselves. The worlds they moved through were not uniformly resistant, which is one of the details that the standard accounts of the Butlerian Jihad tend to underemphasize in favor of the dramatic narrative of conquest. Many populations received the jihad not as an invasion but as a liberation, because the imperial system that Paul had displaced had not been, for large portions of the human universe, a benevolent administrative structure whose displacement required mourning. The numbers, when Paul allowed himself to hold them in the full clarity of what they represented, rather than in the abstracted form of strategic reports, were of the kind that exceed the ordinary human capacity for grief and require a different cognitive and emotional register, one that does not have a commonly agreed name but that functions something like the state that extreme cold produces in the body. A numbing that is itself a form of protection against a stimulus too intense to be processed in its full intensity without systemic damage. 61 billion lives, across dozens of worlds, altered or ended in the first 12 years of the jihad, a figure that Paul carried not as a statistic, but as the specific weight of a responsibility whose acceptance had been the price of every good thing the transformation of his power had made possible. He had known this figure approximately before the jihad began. He had chosen to proceed anyway, because the futures in which the jihad did not happen were worse in their outcomes, and this justification, which was genuine and carefully arrived at and based on information no one else had access to, sat inside him with the specific discomfort of something that is both true and insufficient simultaneously. The Bene Gesserit watched the empire he was building with the complex attention of an organization that had invested 90 generations in producing him, and had not received what they had invested in, which is to say they had received more than they planned for in certain dimensions and considerably less in others, and the net result was an institutional relationship to Paul's reign that oscillated between the satisfaction of an organization watching its longest project come to partial fruition and the alarm of an organization watching a partially controlled experiment exceed its containment parameters. The Kwisatz Haderach had been intended as a tool, a superior human consciousness that would serve the sisterhood's purposes with the enhanced capability they had been breeding toward, not as an independent sovereign whose decisions the sisterhood was now obliged to navigate around rather than direct. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moyem, who had been Paul's first formal Bene Gesserit assessor, and who had administered the Gom Jabbar test that was the sisterhood's primary instrument for identifying human from animal, watched the emperor her order had inadvertently produced with the expression of someone who has set a fire for a specific and limited purpose, and is now watching it become a weather system. The Spacing Guild's relationship to Paul's reign was organised entirely around the spice, as the Guild's relationship to everything was organised entirely around the spice. And the specific nature of that organisation had shifted fundamentally since the confrontation in which Paul had made the threat to destroy the spice cycle, and had made it in a way that left no doubt about his willingness to execute it. The Guild's navigators required melange in quantities that increased with the depth of their biological transformation, and the depth of that transformation was what made interstellar navigation possible, and interstellar navigation was what made the human universe a connected civilization, rather than a collection of isolated planetary populations, and Paul therefore held in his control of Arrakis a lever whose fulcrum was the entire structure of interstellar civilization, and whose operation required only the willingness to accept the consequences of its use. The Guild had accepted, with the specific grace of an organization that understands power dynamics, with the clarity that complete institutional self-interest produces, that the emperor who held this lever was not one they could afford to oppose in the direct manner they had occasionally employed against less strategically positioned rulers. The Mentats who served Paul's administration were among the finest in the Imperium, and they produced analyses of the governance challenges facing the new order with the thoroughness and the precision that Mentat training produced in the very best of its graduates. What their analyses consistently returned, from multiple angles of approach and through multiple frameworks of evaluation, was a version of the same fundamental problem that Paul's prescience had already identified, but that the Mentat analysis made visible in the specific language of political and administrative reality rather than the language of probability futures. The problem was this: the system Paul had built his power on was the same system that made his power unstable. The Jihad had spread the religion of Muad'Dib across the human universe, and that religion was now a social and political force of civilizational scale, and the religion's relationship to Paul himself was the relationship of a thing that has outgrown the person it was organized around. The faith now larger than the faithful's capacity to control it, the mythology now more powerful than the man it mythologized. And the practical consequence was that Paul governed not simply through the mechanisms of imperial authority, but through the continuous and increasingly demanding performance of being what the religion required him to be, a performance that the man inside the performance found progressively more constraining and progressively less sustainable. The Tleilaxu and the Ixians, the two civilizations most invested in the technological and biological alternatives that the imperial system had developed within the constraints of the Butlerian Jihad's prohibitions, observed the new order with the particular attention of institutions whose specific capabilities represented either threats to or resources for the regime, depending on how the regime chose to use them. The Tleilaxu, whose biological engineering had produced some of the most sophisticated and most ethically troubling artifacts in the known universe, including the Golas, the reconstructed individuals grown from dead cell material in their axolotl tanks, occupied a position in the imperial ecosystem that was simultaneously indispensable and deeply distrusted. Indispensable because their biological capabilities could not be replicated by any other institution, and deeply distrusted because those capabilities were precisely the kind of thing that Butlerian philosophy had always been most uncomfortable about when it appeared in biological rather than mechanical form. The question of whether a sufficiently sophisticated biological technology was meaningfully different from the thinking machines the Jihad had prohibited was one that the Tleilaxu had been living inside for centuries, and that the imperial religious establishment had been declining to answer with any precision, because precision in that area led to conclusions that were inconvenient for the various parties who benefited from the ambiguity. Within the domestic space of the imperial household, the tensions that would eventually produce the crisis of succession were developing with the slow inevitability of structural stresses in a building that appears sound and is not. Princess Irulan, the political wife whose intelligence and education made her a genuinely formidable figure, and whose personal situation made her a genuinely sympathetic one, had accepted the architecture of her marriage with the formal grace that her Bene Gesserit training and her aristocratic formation produced in difficult circumstances, and had channeled the energies that a different life might have directed elsewhere into the writing of the biographical and historical accounts of Muad'Dib that would become among the most widely read documents in the human universe. Shaping the mythology of Paul's reign with the skill of someone who was simultaneously inside the events she was describing and professionally committed to the craft of description. Her accounts were accurate in their facts and carefully shaped in their emphasis, and the shaping was not dishonest exactly, but was the work of someone who had her own stake in how the story was told, and who was skilled enough at the craft of telling to make the stake invisible in the telling. Alia moved through the imperial household and the political structure surrounding it as something that had no precise category in the social and institutional frameworks available, because no framework had been designed to accommodate what she was. Born pre-born, awakened to full consciousness before birth by her mother's spice transformation, she carried the other memory in a way that differed from how it was carried by Reverend Mothers, who had undergone the transformation as adults. Because for Alia there had been no previous self to expand into the larger consciousness, no adult identity established before the flood of accumulated female genetic memory arrived. She had always been, simultaneously, herself and the chorus, the individual and the accumulated, and the psychological architecture required to maintain a stable self within that condition was something she had been building since birth without a template, because no template existed. The Bene Gesserit called what had happened to her abomination, a word that carried within it both a genuine theological concern and the specific alarm of an organization watching a development it had not designed and could not control, and Alia had been living inside that designation since before she could speak, which had given her a relationship to the sisterhood's institutional opinion of her existence that could be most accurately described as settled contempt. Paul governed, and the Jihad moved, and the spice flowed, and the worms moved in the deep desert, and Chani remained herself, which is to say she remained the person in Paul's life who was not performing a role, in the drama the universe had constructed around him, and in this she was, without intending to be and without requiring recognition for it, the single, most stabilizing force in the life of the most powerful human being in the known universe. She had given him a son and was carrying another child, and the pregnancy was present in the prescient visions with the specific quality that important things had in the probability space, a weight and a centrality that was not always comfortable to observe, but that Paul had learned to observe without flinching, because flinching from what the prescience showed was the first step toward the kind of selective attention that produced exactly the catastrophic surprises the prescience existed to prevent. He looked at what was coming with open eyes. He held Chani's hand in the evenings when the desert light moved through the filtered windows in the particular amber quality that was Arrakis asserting its continuous and impartial presence, and the worms moved in the sand below, and the Empire moved in the space above, and the moment between them was the only thing that was simply itself, and he was present in it with everything he had, which was, for the time being, enough. The spice is still in the air, even now, even here, drifting at the edges of awareness like something half-remembered from a dream that has not quite finished releasing you, and you have travelled far tonight, across the deep desert and the long centuries, through the grief of houses fallen and the quiet endurance of people who made their home in the most unforgiving place the human universe ever produced, and found there not merely survival, but something that deserved the older and more careful word of wisdom. You have walked with those who carried the weight of seeing too far, and with those who carried the weight of feeling everything fully, and with those who asked, in the darkness beneath the sand, whether the future belonged to power or to patience, and found, as the desert always finds, that the question and the asking of it were themselves the answer. Let the dunes settle now. Let the